Hi, everybody. It's Mary again, and I'm here to talk to you guys about neuroscience, which is the biological approach to psychology, and how you would go about teaching the content and making it easier for your students to understand some of the difficult topics. Just want to give everybody a reminder at our social media. We have at Think Fiveable on Twitter, at Think Fiveable on Instagram, and at Think Fiveable on YouTube. It's a great way to catch up and find out about all the different channels we have here at Fiveable. In this stream, we're going to talk about several things. Why we have to cover the brain, why we need to go over the anatomy of the brain, and how all the different parts of our brain are important and play key roles in human behavior. I'm going to simplify and break down the content in such a structured way so it's easier to understand. And then I'm also going to apply it to everyday use because that's just something I like to do with my students because it makes it more understandable. And then we're going to put it to the test. So why the brain? When I first became a psychology teacher, I was really nervous about teaching this topic because I'm not really big on anatomy and phys, and for me to teach it, and it's been a while because I've been teaching it for 14 years, it became I used to get really frustrated because I never thought I would get comfortable with the content. But if you look at it and the reasons why, it makes it a little bit easier to understand when you're teaching. So we're going to talk about the biological approach to psychology and emphasize the school of thought and why that school of thought is so important, which is the perspective of biological approach to psychology. We're going to talk about how students need to understand how the biology of the brain affects human behavior because it does a lot. In fact, every day we're affected by the biology, the way our brain works. How the last 15 years has become revolution in neuroscience and psychology because of technology, and how that has given us a window into the brain to be able to prove some of the illnesses like schizophrenia previously that people didn't believe was real. Now we can actually see the chemical imbalances in the brain happening, and that proves the point. And if you still have students that really still don't understand why the brain plays a whole part in human behavior, there's always this thing that I was taught at the many different institutes I went through during the summer. And each teacher has gone over, and basically the brain is the home of what they call the 4 Fs. Have any of you ever heard of the 4 Fs before? So when they talk about the home of the 4 Fs, the lower part of the brain really drives behavior because the lower part of the brain deals with feeding, your hunger, what makes us hungry, fighting, aggressiveness, fear, the way we, how deep we feel fear, and fornication, attraction to other people. We call it the 4 Fs. All 4 of those things deal with the brain and human behavior, and all those drives originate from the brain. And when you kind of put it out like that, it makes it a little bit more easier for your students to understand how the brain plays an important role in human behavior. Like, for example, I'll give you an example about the 4 Fs. Hungry. So you're eating food and you're sitting there, mind you, you're really hungry, you have the best appetite in the world, and then all of a sudden someone walks over and they're talking to you and they sneeze all over your food. Where did your appetite go? And how does the brain play a part in that? Because your hunger was driving you. If you've ever gotten a headache because you're hungry, right? My daughter likes to call it hangry, because you get angry when you have that lack of appetite. You're just about to satisfy that hunger, making you feel good because there ain't nothing like eating your favorite food, and someone sneezes on it. Do you really want to touch food? Now you become disgusted. You become disgusted because of what you've seen happen to your food. I ain't touching that. It's got someone's germs all over it. So that's that. Then we have fear. So what drives your fear? I'm a big Horror Nights person, so I go to Universal Horror Nights every year. And I don't know if you guys have it on the East Coast, if any of you live in Florida, but depending on what are you more afraid of? Some people are afraid of roller coasters. Some people are afraid of Michael Myers. Some people are afraid of Jason. Some people are afraid of Dracula. Some people are afraid of dogs. What drives your fear? And not all that is from your brain. Okay. So we have fear and we have feeding. Now we have fighting. What makes you angry? Everybody has a button. Your button's in your memory. Where's your memory stored? In your brain. So you have fighting, and then you have fornication. We all know what we're attracted to, where our desires come from. What are you attracted to? Only you know, because it's up here in your brain. So that's how the brain affects behavior, and that's the home of the 4 Fs. Does that make sense? So the easiest thing I do when teaching about the brain, because there's so many parts, and when you look at that book, and I don't know what book most of you work out of, we work out of the Myers book over here on the West Coast, but it has over 83 vocab terms, and that can be really intimidating for students. So I start out with the basic parts of the brain, which are the 4 lobes. And as soon as my students understand what each lobe is basically in charge of, then we break down the different parts of the brain, the lower brain, every part of it, the neurotransmitters. But I want my students to understand the basic concepts of the brain, which is teaching about those 4 lobes. And that you can basically do that in one day. So the frontal lobe, which is located right here, that's where your personality is stored. That's where everything that makes you you is stored. Okay. And then we have our occipital lobe back here, located all the way back. And the funny thing is, have any of you ever fell and hit the back of your head and then seen stars? Gotta wait and see. Most of my students or someone has hit the back of their head. When that happens, it's because your occipital lobe controls your vision. So your occipital lobe is related to your vision. Your frontal lobe is related to who you are, your personality, and your memories, right? And then you have your parietal lobe, which is in between. And that's your sensory cortex and your motor cortex, all located in here. Then you have, voila, right here, which is your temporal. And you have your auditory. Everything's right here. So as long as you understand those basic functions, then it can kind of lead to you understanding the rest of breaking down of the brain. Because all of these things work in conjunction with each other to help your brain work. And also, although the emotion that you're feeling is driven from the lower part of your brain, the way you think, your memories, and what stores your fears, what disgusts you and all that, or what you're attracted to is all right here in the frontal. So each part plays a part. So that's why I always tell my students, it's really important to understand how the 4 lobes work. Because if you understand how the 4 lobes work, then it's a little bit easier to understand the next steps and everything. After we go over the basic anatomy, I start teaching about Phineas Gage. Because prior to technology, the only way doctors learned about human behavior and how brain damage affects human behavior was accidents and things that would happen, medical stuff that would happen to people. The most famous one is Phineas Gage, of course, and he's the gentleman that had a railroad pike, if I remember correctly. It went straight through up here through his cortex and affected behavior. But now we can go back and look. And if you look him up online and you were to go on Google and type in Phineas Gage, you can actually see a video of how this thing went through his I believe, if I remember correctly, lower up here, went and through part of his frontal. And it affected his behavior very much because prior to this accident, he was very he could control his temper. He was everybody liked him. After the accident, his emotions were all over the place. He couldn't handle anything. He lost his temper. He would explode, and his life changed dramatically. Then as soon as we figure out how that works, and we talk about how the early doctors try to figure out what happens to your brain affects everything, then eventually technology comes along. And then with technology, that's when you can start showing the different parts of what each technological, the MRI, the PET, the EET, all these different things that give us access to looking into the brain and seeing how the brain works. Specifically now, because I don't know if any of you have gotten the new book and how we're supposed to include dreaming and sleeping when we cover the brain under the brain unit. And it makes us able, with the machine, you can actually see when dreams are happening and when your brain is active. But it's really important to understand how all of these things that come from your brain affect human behavior. So after you break down the major parts of the brain, and then you break down the lower brain, and then you break down how the neural networks work, then you go from there. But the very first thing I do to make sure my students understand how the brain works is the day after I've gone over the lobes, my kids come in the next day and I'll pull out an old video. Like most kids have seen a Disney video. So I'll pull out like a video of The Lion King, and then I'll play like 2 minutes of it for my whole class. And then I'll say, okay, pop quiz. The kids are like, what? And I'm like, tell me how many different parts of your brain you just used right now watching that 2-minute video. And the kids all draw a blank. How many different parts, if I was to show you a clip from the beginning of The Lion King, and I want you to think how many is going through your head right now? Who here has seen The Lion King? Okay, so when you're watching the video, you hear the music. So what part of the brain gets to hearing? And then when you're watching the video, what other part are you using? You're using your eyes, which is your occipital lobe. And then you're also using your frontal lobe because you're accessing your memory, because you're remembering when you first saw the movie. So you're pretty much using a whole lot of different parts of your brain. And that kind of tells me whether or not the kids kind of understand the basics and I can move on to the next, which makes it a lot easier. I just find that if you simplify content, the kids are able to move to the more complex afterward. And then when you get to that complex part and you simplify that, it makes it a whole lot easier for students to understand content. And to me, if my students understand what I'm teaching, then I've done my job. So I'm gonna move on to the next slide before I keep on talking, because I could talk forever, good Lord. So when you're teaching about the brain, you kind of have to, like I said, talk about the brain and ask students questions, what parts of brain using, like, okay, so we're taking notes. Ms. Valdez is giving notes in class. Okay, they're like, yeah. I go, okay, well, you're taking notes right now, right? So what part of the brain are you using as you're taking notes? It's the same exact question I asked them when they're watching the Lion King movie. Okay, so what parts of your brain can anybody tell me that you're using right now as you're listening to me? Well, I mean, honestly, the easiest one is the occipital, because you're all watching. You're all watching. You have to use your eyes. So when you do that, it makes the kids think. When you attach it to what they're doing and the present moment in time, when you can attach it to an everyday concept, it makes it easier for students to understand. It simplifies the content. And when you simplify it, you can relate it to them and it makes it easier to learn. We also talk about, like I said, the technological tools that exist today that help us look at the brain. We can see lesions in the brain. The MRI, if I remember correctly, the MRI machine allows us to see the chemical imbalances in the brain that are caused by depression and also by schizophrenia. And if any of you are not familiar with the illness of schizophrenia, most people who suffer from schizophrenia, they suffer from hearing voices. Now, no one else hears the voices, their brain hears the voices. And people used to think this was made up, that it wasn't real. But we can now look into the brain of a schizophrenic person and you can see the auditory area of their brain turn on as they're hearing voices that we don't hear. So that's why these technological tools are so important, and that's why you have to learn about them. You have to make the content relevant to make the students want to learn it. If you can't make it relevant, if you can't make it touch to their everyday life, if you can't simplify it, it makes it so much more difficult to understand the content. And then, like as I was saying before, how injuries and disease can affect the human behavior. Parkinson's is an illness that affects the brain. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Parkinson's disease, but it affects your motor skills and your senses. And that's located where? In your brain. Have you ever heard of people who hit their head so hard when they wake up? What is the first thing a doctor asks them? What day is it? What day is it? What's the date? Do you know your name? Because if you get hit in the head too hard, it can cause and affect your behavior. It can cause brain damage, concussions. Hello, I'm assuming that some teachers have had students who are athletes it affects their ability to learn in the classroom. I have some students that have had to take time off because they get headaches because of the bruising in their brain. So like I said, it's really important to give the kids a everyday concept that relates to what they're touching about and learning in the room. When you do that, it makes it so much easier to understand. From one topic to the next, it's really important to check that the kids understand the topic from the day before. If you see that the majority of students in your room seem to understand and are able to comprehend content, then it's easier to move on to the more complex part. I tend to save the neurons and the neurons transmitters and talking about that till the end, because to me, that's a little bit more complex when it comes to the brain, understanding how they work, because there's so many different ones and they each are in charge of various different things. So that's the little part that I leave towards the end. So I go from the simple to the simple to a little bit harder to a little bit harder to the more complex. But if you can get the neurotransmitters, and I have a way to do it, and I'll talk about it, but I'll wait till after Megan goes over it with you guys next week. I'll show you the project that I do next week on my activities thing, and it's really easy. And I relate it to superheroes, so I always like to have fun with it, and that tends to make my students understand it a little bit better. As I was telling everybody before, I used to be nervous when teaching about the brain. Even today, and even giving this, I still feel like, do I really have everything down? Am I able to answer every single one of my students' questions? And am I comfortable answering these questions? And did I teach enough of the content so that the students can become successful on the AP exam? Everybody here needs to know the neuroscience topic is a very important part of the AP exam. I'd say is that if I remember correctly, 10 to 15% of the AP exam is the science chapter. Guess what the next 10 to 15% is? The brain. Why the brain? Well, the neuroscience approach, how the brain affects behavior, how everything about the brain can affect our everyday life. Think about it. Feeding, fear, fighting, and fornication. Are those things that touch our everyday lives? The 4 F's? Although you might feel a little overwhelmed when learning all this content and seeing all the vocab and teaching this content, because it took me a while to get comfortable with it. Like I said, simplifying it makes it so much easier. But just understand that it is a simple thing if you break it down. You should go lobes. Then after you do lobes, you go over the different part, like the lower brain, which I talk about, which is the home of the 4 F's, and the different parts of that, and how the different parts are in charge of different things that relate to the 4 F's. And then after you complete that, then you can move to the sensory strip and the motor strip and how that affects and how that works. Then you talk about injuries and how injuries can affect behavior. And then you talk about, as you move from injuries, then you talk about the different machines that allow us to look into the brain and look how the brain processes. I mean, they even have machines now that they'll ask you a question and you can see the part of the brain that lights up. A couple of my favorite topics to teach that my students really like is left brain and right brain. Depending on your handedness, you're either left brain dominant or right brain dominant. And students tend to love to figure out which is which and why. Because when you're one side of your brain is more analytical, the other side of your brain is more artistic. And are you someone who's left brain dominant or right brain dominant? Or are you someone that can use both hands? And then why are there so many people that can use both? And I always throw personal stuff in there because my sister is left-handed, and she went to school at a time when they used to force left-handed children to use their right hand because being left-handed was looked at as a handicap. And they used to force the issue to use. Can you imagine how weird it is when you first start to use scissors? And if you've ever seen a little kid gripping onto scissors, right? Now imagine using the hand that isn't natural and having to use a pair of scissors. And that's all related to the brain and brain dominance. And if like I said, that relates to the student. Are you left-handed or are you right-handed? Who in here is good at math? Who in here is good at art? that's related to the dominant side of the brain. And sometimes it doesn't even relate because just like I said, nothing in science is absolute. And sometimes you'll have a person who is one side brain dominant where they're supposed to be really good at math and they suck at math. Or you have the other person that is artistically dominant on the brain side, and then it's vice versa. But I always like to do these little experiments and stuff in class because the kids understand and relate to what you're teaching. When you can give them a real life example, when you can show how it relates to them, it makes it easier to remember, understand, and they learn the content. Does anybody have any questions or comments about anything I covered today that I can go back over? So just remember that after every lesson, you need to check for understanding. Make sure that you, as you're moving from day to day, there is this one great thing that I could tell you about when, besides the Phineas Gage case, if any of you can find the little video about, because all my kids trip out on brain plasticity when I show them this video, but there's a little girl that has an illness, and I think I'll put it on my Twitter, and I'll try to upload my Twitter the next week so you guys can see the video. And it's about a little girl who ends up having seizures a lot. So they have to do a lobotomy where they take half of her brain. But she's so little, and my students trip on it every year. She's so little that after they take that part of her brain out, they think that the doctors aren't sure if she's going to grow up normal, she's going to be able to go to school every day and have a fun everyday life. And guess what? Because of the brain and the magnificence of the brain and how plasticity works, this girl goes to school. She goes to dance classes, does not have any learning issues. And this is like 2 or 3 years later after the operation where they took, and she's only living with one half of her brain. So, and I'll try and give everybody access to it and go and talk about the various activities that I was talking about and put the Twitter up for next week. Okay. But I hope I was able to help everybody, and let me know by please taking part in my poll. If let's see if anybody voted. Maybe I know I'm still kind of intimidated by the brain myself, but it becomes easier and easier, and the more you make it easier for your students, the easier it will be. The important 3 things that you have to do, though, is you have to tell students why the brain is important to learn about. And if they don't get about the injuries, and if they don't get about the other 3 things that I said, explain to them the 4 F's, because the 4 F's students can relate to, because they're hungry every day. They felt fear every day. They've been aggressive and angry, fighting every day, and they've been attracted to people, fornication every day. So when you can relate it to how it affects them, it makes it easier. Once you make it easier, you simplify it for understanding, and then you do activities to double check and make sure that they understand as you move from one content to the next. Try to remember that at Think Fiveable, we have our Twitter and social media, we have our Instagram, and we have our YouTube. But I hope I was able to help everybody out, because I simplify it, and the easier you simplify something, the easier it is to learn. I hope to see you all next week, and thanks for coming by. See ya.